The small town of Millfield had always prided itself on preserving its history. The local museum occupied what was once the town hall, a stately brick building with white columns and large windows that had been renovated and expanded over the decades. Inside, the exhibits told the story of the town from its founding in the early 1800s through the present day. The museum wasn't large, but it was thorough and well maintained, run by a dedicated staff who genuinely cared about the stories they were preserving. Sarah Bennett had been the head curator for the past 5 years. At 37, she had the perfect blend of academic credentials and genuine enthusiasm that made her excellent at her job. She had grown up in Millfield, left for college and graduate school, and returned with a master's degree in museum studies and a passion for local history. Her office was on the second floor of the museum, a converted storage room with tall windows that looked out over the town square. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with reference materials, and her desk was perpetually covered in papers, folders, and the occasional coffee mug. It was early March, and Sarah was in the middle of preparing for a new exhibit on the town's industrial period from 1850 to 1900. Millfield had once been home to a thriving textile mill that employed most of the town's residents. The mill had closed in the 1950s, but its impact on the town's development was significant, and Sarah felt it deserved a dedicated exhibit. "Hey Sarah, do you have a minute?" David Reynolds, the museum's archivist, stood in her doorway. At 45, David had worked at the museum longer than anyone else. He had a thinning hairline and wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. He was holding a cardboard box that looked like it had seen better days. "Sure, what's up?" Sarah pushed aside the stack of papers she'd been working on. "Mrs. Whitaker just dropped this off. Apparently her great-aunt passed away last month, and they found this in her attic. She thought we might be interested." He set the box on her desk. Amelia Whitaker was in her 80s and had been a supporter of the museum for as long as Sarah could remember. Her family had been in Millfield for generations, and she had donated numerous items over the years. "Did she say what's in it?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the box. "Just that it's old family stuff from the mill days. I haven't had a chance to look through it yet." Sarah nodded. "I'll check it out. Thanks, David." After David left, Sarah opened the box. Inside were several yellowed envelopes, a few small leather-bound books that looked like journals, and a flat wooden case about the size of a modern laptop. She carefully removed the items one by one, examining each briefly before setting it aside. The journals belonged to someone named William Whitaker, dated 1874 to 1876. The envelopes contained letters, many of them correspondence between William and various business associates. The wooden case, however, caught her attention. It was made of dark, polished wood with a simple brass latch. Sarah carefully opened it to find a glass photograph plate nestled in a velvet lining. The plate was about 8 by 10 inches, a substantial size for a photograph from that era. Sarah knew that glass plate negatives were the standard medium for photography in the late 19th century, before the introduction of film. This one appeared to be in remarkably good condition, but she couldn't make out the image on the negative itself. She would need to have it properly processed to see what had been captured. Excited by the find, Sarah took the glass plate to the museum's small conservation lab on the first floor. The lab was equipped with basic preservation tools and a digital scanner specifically designed for handling delicate photographic materials. Jenna Parker, the museum's conservator, was working at her desk when Sarah entered. At 29, Jenna was the youngest full-time staff member, but she was exceptionally skilled at her job. She had a background in art conservation and had joined the museum 2 years ago. "Jenna, do you have time to help me with something?" Sarah asked, carefully holding the wooden case. Jenna looked up from her computer. "Sure. What do you have there?" "Glass plate negative. Probably from the 1870s based on the other materials it was found with. It's in good condition, but I'd like to see what's on it. Think you can scan it for me?" Jenna's eyes lit up. She loved working with old photographs. "Absolutely. Let me see it." Sarah handed over the case, and Jenna carefully examined the glass plate. "This is in amazing condition for something this old. Let me get it scanned for you." She placed the negative on the specialized scanner, making adjustments to ensure it was properly supported. The scanner was designed to handle fragile materials, using gentle light and high-resolution imaging to capture the details without causing damage. "This will take a few minutes." Jenna said as she started the process. "The scanner will create a digital positive from the negative, so we'll be able to see the actual image." Sarah nodded, watching as Jenna worked. The conservation lab was her favorite room in the museum, filled with tools and equipment that helped preserve the past. The walls were lined with storage cabinets containing acid-free boxes and tissue paper, cotton gloves, and various cleaning solutions specifically formulated for historical materials. After a few minutes, the scanner completed its work, and Jenna turned to her computer to retrieve the image. "Let's see what we've got." The image appeared on her screen, and both women leaned forward to get a better look. It was a group photograph, typical of the formal portraits taken in the late 19th century. About 20 people stood in 3 rows, the men seated in front with the women standing behind them. They were dressed in the style of the 1870s, the men in dark suits with high collars, the women in long dresses with their hair pulled back. "It looks like a company portrait," Sarah said, studying the image. "Probably the mill management." "The quality is remarkable," Jenna commented, zooming in on various parts of the image. "Look at the detail in their faces." The photograph had been taken in front of what appeared to be the mill building, a large brick structure with many windows. The people in the image stared solemnly at the camera, as was customary in photographs of that era due to the long exposure times required. "Can you make a high-resolution print for me?" Sarah asked. "I'd like to include this in the new exhibit." "Sure, I'll do that now." Jenna began the printing process on their large format printer, which was capable of producing museum-quality reproductions. As the printer hummed to life, Sarah continued to study the digital image on the screen. Something about it caught her attention, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The formal arrangement of the subjects was typical for the time, and the mill building in the background was exactly what she would expect for a company photograph. "Wait," she said suddenly, pointing to the screen. "Can you zoom in on that window? The one on the second floor to the right." Jenna adjusted the view, zooming in on the section Sarah had indicated. The window was partly visible behind the group, one of many that lined the mill building's facade. As the image enlarged, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The window, unlike the others which showed only darkness or reflections, contained what looked like a face, pale, with dark hollows where the eyes should be, pressed against the glass as if watching the photograph being taken. "Do you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenna leaned closer to the screen. "That's odd. It could be a reflection, or maybe someone was working inside. But the face didn't look like it belonged to a living person. It was too pale, too still, with features that seemed slightly distorted, and there was something unsettling about the way it was positioned, as if it were observing the group from above. "It doesn't look right," Sarah said. "Can you enhance that section?" Jenna worked on the image, adjusting the contrast and sharpness to bring out more detail. As the face became clearer, Sarah felt her unease grow. The face wasn't just pale, it was unnaturally white, with a mouth that seemed too wide and eyes that were little more than dark pits. It wasn't a reflection or a worker, it was something else entirely. "That's creepy," Jenna said, voicing what they were both thinking. "It almost looks like..." "Like what?" Sarah prompted when Jenna didn't finish her thought. Jenna shook her head. "I don't know. Not like a person, though. Maybe it's just damage to the negative or a trick of the light." Sarah wasn't convinced. The face was too distinct, too deliberately positioned to be a mere flaw in the photographic process. And there was something about its expression, a kind of hungry watchfulness, that made her skin crawl. The printer finished its work and Jenna retrieved the high-resolution print. The image was now on archival paper, about 16 by 20 inches, large enough to display in the exhibit. The enlarged size made the group portrait more impressive, but also made the face in the window more noticeable. "I'm going to do some research on this photograph," Sarah said, taking the print. "There might be something in the journals or letters that explains who these people are and when exactly this was taken." "Let me know what you find out," Jenna replied, her gaze lingering on the window in the image. "And about that." Sarah returned to her office with the print and the box of materials. She spent the rest of the afternoon going through William Whitaker's journals, looking for any mention of a group photograph or the mill. The journals were written in a neat, precise hand, detailing the daily operations of the mill and occasional personal observations. William Whitaker had been the mill manager from 1870 until his death in 1879. His entries were primarily concerned with production numbers, worker issues, and business matters, but there were occasional glimpses into his personal life and the broader community. Sarah found what she was looking for in an entry dated May 15, 1875. Today we gathered for a photograph to commemorate the mill's 20th year of operation. Mr. Harding brought his camera and equipment from Boston. All senior staff were present, with the exception of Thomas, who continues to be absent since the accident. The photograph took some time to arrange, as Mr. Harding insisted on perfect composition. Several of the women complained of feeling cold, though the day was quite warm. I myself felt a strange sensation during the exposure, as if being watched. Perhaps it was merely the discomfort of standing still for so long. Sarah read the entry several times, focusing on the details. The accident mentioned was likely a reference to a mill accident, which were unfortunately common in that era. But it was the mention of the cold and the feeling of being watched that caught her attention. It seemed to suggest that something unusual had happened during the taking of the photograph. She continued reading, hoping to find more information about Thomas or the accident, but the subsequent entries returned to routine business matters. It wasn't until nearly a month later, on June 10th, that William mentioned anything that might be relevant. Had a strange dream last night. I was back at the mill, but it was empty of workers. I heard machinery running on the upper floor and went to investigate. In the spinning room, I found Thomas standing by the window, his back to me. When I called to him, he turned, but his face was wrong somehow. I woke in a cold sweat. I miss my friend, but these dreams do nothing to ease my grief. This entry confirmed that Thomas had died in some kind of accident, and it hinted at William's troubled state of mind afterward. But it didn't explain the face in the window of the photograph. Sarah turned to the letters, sorting through them chronologically. Most were business correspondence, but she found a personal letter from William to his sister, dated April 3, 1875. Dear Margaret, I write with heavy heart to inform you of a terrible accident at the mill. Thomas fell into the new mechanical loom yesterday. By the time we managed to stop the machinery, he was beyond help. The doctor says death was instantaneous, which provides small comfort. Thomas had been with the mill since its beginning and was not just a colleague, but a dear friend. His loss is felt keenly by all. The workers are shaken, particularly those who witnessed the accident. I have given them 2 days of paid leave to recover their spirits. Production will suffer, but I believe it is necessary for morale. I find myself troubled by more than grief. Thomas had expressed concerns about the new machinery, saying it was unsafe. I dismissed his worries as resistance to change, a decision I now bitterly regret. More disturbing still, several workers claim to have seen Thomas in the mill after his death, particularly near the window of the spinning room where he spent much of his time. I attribute this to their distress and the poor lighting in that part of the building. Please share this news with Father gently. He thought highly of Thomas and will be saddened to learn of his passing. Your loving brother, William. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing what she had just read. Thomas had died in a machinery accident shortly before the photograph was taken, and people had reported seeing him afterward, specifically near a window in the spinning room. She looked at the photograph again, focusing on the face in the window. Could it be Thomas? The timing fit, and the location matched the descriptions in William's writings. But how could a dead man appear in a photograph? Sarah wasn't superstitious by nature. She dealt in historical facts and tangible artifacts, but she couldn't deny the chill that ran through her as she considered the possibility that the photograph had captured something supernatural. She needed more information. The name Thomas was common, but perhaps she could find out his full name and more details about the accident. The museum's archives contained old newspapers from Millfield, including the local paper from the 1870s, the Millfield Gazette. Sarah left her office and headed to the archives, a large room in the basement of the museum where older, less frequently accessed materials were stored. The room was climate-controlled to protect the delicate documents, and the walls were lined with metal shelving units containing boxes and folders carefully labeled and organized. David was still there, working at a large table in the center of the room. He looked up as Sarah entered. "Find anything interesting in that box?" he asked. "Actually, yes," Sarah replied, setting down the photograph and the letter she had found. "Take a look at this." David studied the photograph, his expression changing as he noticed the face in the window. "What am I looking at here?" "A group photograph of the mill management from 1875. Sarah explained. "But look at that window in the background." David leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. "Is that a face?" "I think so. And I found this letter that might explain it." She handed him the letter from William to his sister. David read it quickly, his eyebrows rising. "Thomas, the man who died in the mill accident?" "Exactly. The photograph was taken just a few weeks after his death, and people were claiming to see him near a window in the spinning room. I think that might be him in the photograph." David looked skeptical. "Sarah, you know as well as I do that there are plenty of rational explanations for this. It could be a double exposure, or damage to the negative, or even just a worker who happened to be standing there." I know, Sarah said, acknowledging the logical alternatives. "But the timing is strange, don't you think? And the specific mention of people seeing him at the window?" "Coincidences happen," David said with a shrug. "What are you looking for down here?" "The Millfield Gazette from April 1875. There might be a report about the accident that could give us more information." David nodded. "Should be in Section C, boxes 12 through 15 for that decade." Sarah found the relevant box and carefully removed the bound volume of newspapers from April to June 1875. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. She brought it back to the table and began scanning through the issues. She found what she was looking for in the April 2nd, 1875 edition. A front-page article with the headline, "Tragic Accident at Millfield Mill Claims Life." The article provided more details about the incident. "A tragic accident occurred yesterday at the Millfield textile mill, resulting in the death of Thomas Blackwood, 42, who had served as the mill's mechanical supervisor for nearly 20 years. According to witnesses, Mr. Blackwood was examining a newly installed mechanical loom when his clothing became caught in the machinery. Despite the quick action of nearby workers who attempted to stop the machine, Mr. Blackwood suffered fatal injuries. Mill manager William Whitaker has ordered a full investigation into the incident and has temporarily halted operations out of respect for the deceased and to allow workers time to recover from the shocking event. Mr. Blackwood leaves behind a wife, Jane, and 2 children. Funeral services will be held at St. Mark's Church on Sunday." There was a small photograph accompanying the article, showing a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a full beard. The caption identified him as Thomas Blackwood. Sarah studied the face, trying to compare it to the indistinct features visible in the window of the group photograph, but it was difficult to make a definitive connection. She continued looking through the newspaper, finding a follow-up article a week later that mentioned the investigation into the accident had concluded it was a tragic mishap with no specific fault assigned. The mill had resumed operations, and a fund had been established for Blackwood's family. Sarah was about to close the volume when another headline caught her eye, dated May 20th, 1875, just a few days after the group photograph was taken, according to Williams' journal. "Mill workers report strange occurrences." The article was brief but intriguing. Several employees of the Millfield textile mill have reported unusual experiences in recent weeks, including unexplained cold spots, tools moving without explanation, and glimpses of a figure resembling the late Thomas Blackwood, who died in a tragic accident last month. Mill manager William Whitaker dismissed these reports as the result of overwork and lingering distress over Mr. Blackwood's death, stating, "Our workers have endured a difficult time, and such fancies are not uncommon following tragedy." However, the reports have been numerous enough to attract attention, with some workers refusing to enter certain areas of the mill, particularly the spinning room where Mr. Blackwood spent much of his time. Mr. Whitaker has announced that a local minister will be invited to the mill to offer prayers for the deceased, in hopes of calming the workers' fears. Sarah read the article twice, her excitement growing. This provided even more context for the strange face in the photograph. Not only had Thomas Blackwood died shortly before the photograph was taken, but workers had been reporting seeing his ghost in the mill, specifically in the spinning room, which, based on the architecture of mill buildings from that era, was likely on the second floor where the face appeared in the window. "David, look at this," she called, pushing the newspaper toward him. David read the article, his skepticism visibly wavering. "Okay, that's a bit more compelling, but still, ghost stories were common in that time period, especially after accidents. People were looking for ways to process grief and assign meaning to senseless tragedies." "I understand that," Sarah said. "But it doesn't explain how a face appeared in that window in the photograph. A face that According to these accounts, multiple people had been seen in the same location. David rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Do we know what happened to Thomas Blackwood's family? His wife and children? Sarah shook her head. Not yet, but that's a good question. If they stayed in Millfield, there might be descendants who could provide more information. I can help you look into that, David offered, his interest clearly piqued despite his initial skepticism. Town records from that period should tell us if they remained here or moved away. That would be great, Sarah said. I'm going to keep going through William Whitaker's journals to see if there's anything else about Thomas or the photograph. They agreed to reconvene the next morning to share what they found. Sarah returned to her office with the newspaper and the photograph, her mind racing with possibilities. If Thomas Blackwood's ghost had been haunting the mill, had the camera somehow captured his spectral image? Or was there a more mundane explanation that she was overlooking in her excitement? She spent the rest of the afternoon reading through more of William's journals, finding occasional references to unusual occurrences at the mill, unexplained machinery stoppages, cold spots that workers complained about, and a general sense of unease that persisted for months after Thomas's death. William never explicitly attributed these events to supernatural causes, but his entries suggested he was troubled by them. By the time Sarah left the museum that evening, she had a folder full of notes and copies of relevant documents. She also had the high-resolution print of the photograph, which she couldn't resist taking home for further study. There was something compelling about the image, something that drew her gaze repeatedly to that window and the face that seemed to watch the assembled group from above. Sarah's apartment was a cozy one-bedroom in a converted Victorian house about a mile from the museum. She had decorated it with a mix of vintage finds and modern comfort, creating a space that reflected her love of history without feeling like a museum itself. She lived alone, having divorced 3 years earlier, and enjoyed the quiet independence of her current life. That night, Sarah spread her research materials on her dining table and continued working while she ate a simple dinner. She examined the photograph again under good light, using a magnifying glass to study the face in the window. The more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that it was a face and not a photographic flaw or a reflection. She found herself staring at it for long periods, trying to discern details in the shadowy features. The eyes were the most disturbing part, dark hollows that seemed to contain a kind of awareness, as if the figure were not just present in the image but actively observing. Eventually, Sarah put the photograph aside and prepared for bed. But her sleep was restless, filled with dreams of endless corridors and a vast mill building, the constant rhythm of machinery, and a figure that always remained just out of sight, watching from windows and doorways. She woke early the next morning, feeling unrested but eager to return to her research. As she dressed, she found herself thinking about the face in the window and wondering what Thomas Blackwood had experienced in his final moments. Had he known he was going to die? Had he felt betrayed by William, who had dismissed his concerns about the machinery's safety? These thoughts followed her to the museum, where she arrived earlier than usual. The building was quiet, with only the security guard present, making his morning rounds. Sarah nodded to him as she passed through the lobby and headed upstairs to her office. To her surprise, David was already there, waiting outside her door with a folder in his hand and an excited expression on his face. "You're here early," she commented as she unlocked her office. "Couldn't sleep," David admitted. "I kept thinking about that photograph and what you found in the newspaper, so I came in early to check the town records. You're not going to believe what I found." They entered her office and Sarah turned on the lights, curious about David's discovery. "What did you find about the Blackwood family?" she asked, setting down her bag and taking off her coat. David opened his folder and laid out several documents on her desk. Jane Blackwood, Thomas's widow, stayed in Millfield after his death. She lived until 1912. Their children were named William and Mary. William moved to Boston in the 1890s, but Mary stayed in Millfield, married a man named Edward Hayes, and had 3 children. "That's interesting, but why are you so excited?" Sarah asked, not seeing the significance yet. David's eyes gleamed behind his glasses. "Because I traced the lineage forward. Mary Blackwood Hayes had a daughter named Elizabeth, who married Henry Whitaker in 1925. Sarah's eyes widened as she made the connection. "Whitaker? As in Amelia Whitaker, who donated the box with the photograph?" "Exactly," David confirmed. Amelia Whitaker's husband was Joseph Whitaker, the son of Elizabeth Hayes Whitaker, who was the granddaughter of Thomas Blackwood. So the photograph and materials weren't passed down through William Whitaker's family line, but through Thomas Blackwood's, Sarah said, the implications sinking in. That means the photograph we have might have been kept by Thomas's family, not William's, despite William being mentioned in the journals. The question is why, and how did William's journals end up with Thomas's descendants? It was a puzzle, and one that made the photograph even more intriguing. If Thomas Blackwood's family had preserved this image for generations, did they know about the face in the window? Had they kept it because it showed something unusual, something connected to their ancestors' tragic death? We need to talk to Amelia Whitaker, Sarah decided. She might know more about the photograph and why it was important to her family. I already called her, David said. She's coming in at 10 this morning. I told her we had some questions about the materials she donated. Sarah glanced at her watch. It was just after 8, giving them nearly 2 hours to prepare. Let's gather everything we've found so far. I want to be able to show her the photograph and the newspaper articles, see if they spark any memories or family stories. They spent the next hour and a half organizing their findings, making additional copies of key documents, and discussing the questions they wanted to ask Amelia. Sarah also continued reading through William's journals, focusing on entries from the months following the photograph. She found another relevant entry from July 8, 1875. The disturbances at the mill continue, despite the minister's prayers and the passage of time. 3 workers have left our employ, citing fears that I can only regard as superstitious. However, I myself experienced something unsettling yesterday evening. I had stayed late to review the quarterly accounts and was alone in the building, or so I believed. As I was preparing to leave, I heard the distinct sound of the mechanical loom starting up on the floor above. I went to investigate, knowing that the machinery should not be operating at that hour. When I reached the room, the loom was still, but I felt a presence there, and the air was remarkably cold despite the summer heat. I called out to Thomas, feeling foolish even as I did so, but received no answer. I am not a man given to fancies, but I left the mill in haste and found myself reluctant to return this morning. I have said nothing to the workers, as their fears need no further encouragement. This entry suggested that even the rational, business-minded William had experienced something he couldn't explain, something that had shaken his skepticism. Sarah found it particularly telling that he had called out to Thomas, suggesting that on some level, he too believed his friend's spirit might be lingering in the mill. At 10 o'clock sharp, the museum's receptionist called up to inform Sarah that Amelia Whitaker had arrived. Sarah asked her to escort Mrs. Whitaker to the small conference room adjacent to the conservation lab, where they had set up their materials. Amelia Whitaker was a tall, elegant woman in her 80s, with silver hair styled in a neat bob and alert blue eyes that missed nothing. She walked with the aid of a cane but otherwise showed few signs of her age. She greeted Sarah and David warmly, having known them both for years through her involvement with the museum. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Whitaker," Sarah said, helping her to a comfortable chair at the conference table. "Amelia, please," the older woman insisted. "We've known each other too long for formality. Now, what's this about the items I donated? Has something caught your interest?" "Very much so," Sarah confirmed, sliding the high-resolution print of the photograph across the table. "We were particularly intrigued by this photograph. Do you know anything about it?" Amelia put on her reading glasses and studied the image, her expression unreadable. "This is the mill photograph," she said after a moment. "It's been in my family for generations." "Did you know about this?" Sarah asked, pointing to the face in the window. Amelia's lips tightened slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, that's Thomas Blackwood, my great-great-grandfather. There's a family story about this photograph." Sarah and David exchanged a glance, both leaning forward with interest. "Would you mind sharing that story with us?" David asked. Amelia seemed to consider the request, then nodded slowly. "I suppose it's time the story was properly documented. My great-grandmother, Mary Blackwood Hayes, used to tell it to her children, and it was passed down to me." She took a sip of water from the glass Sarah had provided, then began. "Thomas Blackwood was the mechanical supervisor at the mill. He was good at his job, respected by the workers, and considered a friend by William Whitaker, the mill manager. When new machinery was brought in from England, Thomas expressed concerns about its safety. He said the gears were exposed in a way that made accidents likely, and he recommended modifications before the looms were put into use. William dismissed these concerns. The new looms would increase production significantly, and he was under pressure from the mill owners to show results. He ordered the machinery to be installed as it was, telling Thomas that the workers would simply need to be more careful. Thomas was checking one of the looms, making notes on possible modifications that could be made without reducing efficiency, when his coat sleeve was caught in the gears. The machinery pulled him in before anyone could help him. He died instantly. His body, well, the details aren't pleasant. After his death, strange things began happening at the mill. Workers reported seeing Thomas, particularly near the window of the spinning room where he had often stood to observe the factory floor. There were cold spots, unexplained machinery stoppages, and a general sense of unease. Most dismissed these as superstition or the natural result of working in a building where a man had died so horribly, but the experiences were persistent. William, feeling guilty about having dismissed Thomas's concerns, arranged for a group photograph to commemorate the mill's anniversary, but also, privately, to honor Thomas's memory. During the taking of the photograph, several people reported feeling unusually cold, despite it being a warm May day. When the photograph was developed, the face appeared in the window. William recognized it immediately as Thomas. He was troubled by it, but kept a copy of the photograph in his office. He became convinced that Thomas's spirit was trapped in the mill, unable to rest because of the circumstances of his death. William began to investigate ways to help Thomas find peace. He consulted with a local minister, but the traditional prayers didn't seem to help. Then he found Thomas's personal journal in his desk at the mill, which contained notes about the unsafe machinery and his plans to continue advocating for changes. William made all the modifications Thomas had recommended at his own expense. He also established a generous fund for Thomas's widow and children, ensuring they would never face financial hardship. And he kept a record of everything, his own journals, Thomas's notes, and the photograph, as evidence of what had happened and what he had done to make amends. The disturbances at the mill gradually subsided after these actions were taken. William eventually gave the collected materials to Jane Blackwood, Thomas's widow, saying they rightfully belonged to her family. They've been passed down ever since, a reminder of Thomas and the impact his life and death had on the mill and the town. Amelia finished her story and looked at Sarah and David, who had listened with rapt attention. That's the family history as it was told to me. I can't vouch for its accuracy, of course, but it's been consistent through the generations. That's remarkable, Sarah said, trying to process everything she had just heard. And it aligns with what we found in William's journals and the newspaper articles from that time. Have you ever had the photograph examined by experts? David asked, to determine if the face might be a double exposure or some other photographic anomaly. Amelia shook her head. No, the family always accepted it for what it appeared to be, evidence that Thomas was still present in some form when the photograph was taken. I'm not saying it was a ghost in the modern sense of the word. Perhaps it was more of an impression left behind, a moment of time captured by the camera that the human eye couldn't see. Or perhaps it was simply a photographic quirk that happened to resemble a face in a meaningful location. The importance was in what it represented to William and to Thomas's family, a reminder that actions have consequences and that making amends matters, even if it comes too late for the person who was wronged. Sarah nodded, appreciating the nuanced perspective. Would you mind if we included this photograph and story in our upcoming exhibit on the industrial period? It's a powerful example of how technological progress often came with human costs, and how communities dealt with tragedy. I donated the materials to the museum for that very purpose, Amelia said with a smile. Stories should be preserved and shared, especially those that might otherwise be forgotten. Thomas Blackwood's death might seem like a minor footnote in history, one of many industrial accidents in that era. But to my family, it's always been a significant event, a turning point that shaped subsequent generations. They talked for a while longer, with Amelia sharing additional family stories about the mill and the photograph. She mentioned that as a child she had been both fascinated and frightened by the image, often staring at it and imagining she could see Thomas's expression change subtly over time. There was one more thing, Amelia said as their conversation wound down. something that wasn't part of the official family story, but that my grandmother once told me in private. She said that as a young girl, she had taken the photograph out of its case one night, curious about it. She fell asleep with it next to her bed and dreamed of a man she knew must be Thomas, though she had never seen him in life. In the dream, he thanked her for remembering him and said he was at peace now. When she woke up, she said the face in the window seemed less distinct, as if it had faded slightly overnight. She believed that by acknowledging him and his story, she had somehow helped him move on a little more. Amelia smiled wryly. That part always sounded like a child's fancy to me, a way of claiming a personal connection to a family legend. But I've always wondered. After Amelia left, Sarah and David sat in the conference room discussing what they had learned. The story had given the photograph a depth and context that made it even more compelling as a historical artifact. "Do you believe it?" David asked after a pause. "That it's actually Thomas Blackwood's ghost in that window?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I believe that something unusual was captured in that photograph, something that had meaning for the people involved. Whether it was truly a supernatural occurrence or a photographic anomaly that happened to take on significance because of the timing, I can't say for certain. But as a historian, I find the personal and social impact of the image more interesting than debating its metaphysical reality." David nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "It's going to make a powerful centerpiece for the exhibit. The personal connection to Amelia makes it even more relevant to our community." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "And I think we should present it with the full context. William's journals, the newspaper articles, and the family story as Amelia shared it. Let visitors draw their own conclusions." They spent the next few days integrating their findings into the plans for the new exhibit. Sarah worked on the display text that would accompany the photograph, carefully balancing historical facts with the more personal, emotional elements of the story. She wanted to honor both the documented history and the family narrative that had been preserved for generations. On Friday afternoon, as Sarah was finalizing the exhibit layout in her office, Jenna appeared in her doorway, looking excited. "Sarah, I've been doing some additional work with that photograph, and I found something interesting," she said, holding a folder. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Sarah replied, curious. "What did you find?" Jenna sat down across from her and opened the folder, revealing several printouts of the photograph at different levels of enhancement. "I've been playing around with different digital techniques to bring out more detail in the image, particularly in that window." She laid out the printouts in sequence, showing the progression as she had increased contrast, adjusted shadows, and applied various filters designed to reveal subtle details. "Look at this version," she said, pointing to the one at the end of the sequence. "I used a technique that's particularly good at bringing out details in the darker areas of old photographs." Sarah leaned forward, studying the image. The face in the window was indeed clearer in this version, with more defined features. She could now make out the shape of the eyes, nose, and mouth, and there was something about the expression that struck her, a mix of sadness and accusation. "That's remarkable," she said. "It really does look like a face now, not just a vague shape that could be interpreted as one." "That's not all," Jenna said, her voice dropping slightly as if she were about to share a secret. "I did a side-by-side comparison with the photograph of Thomas Blackwood from the newspaper article you found." She pulled out another printout, which showed the enhanced window image next to the newspaper photograph, with lines drawn between similar facial features. The beard pattern, the brow line, the shape of the nose, they match, Jenna pointed out. "I'm not claiming it's definitive proof of anything supernatural, but whatever or whoever was captured in that window bears a strong resemblance to Thomas Blackwood." Sarah felt a chill run through her despite the warm office. The comparison was compelling, showing similarities that were hard to dismiss as coincidence. I don't even know what to say. Have you shown this to David?" Jenna shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted you to see it first, since you've been leading the research." "Let's call him in," Sarah decided, reaching for her phone. "He should see this too." David arrived a few minutes later, and Jenna repeated her presentation. He studied the images with his usual careful attention, his skepticism visibly wavering as he took in the evidence. "I have to admit, this is harder to explain away than I initially thought," he said finally. "The resemblance is striking. What do you think we should do with this information?" Sarah asked, looking between her colleagues. "Included in the exhibit," David suggested after a moment's thought. Present the evidence and the analysis alongside the historical context. Let people see what we've found and form their own interpretations." Jenna nodded in agreement. "It adds another layer to the story, regardless of what conclusion people draw about the nature of the image." Sarah considered the suggestion. "I agree, but I think we should be careful about how we frame it. I don't want to sensationalize the story or turn it into a ghost hunt. This is still, fundamentally, about the human impact of industrialization and how communities process tragedy." "Of course," David said. "We can present it as an interesting analytical finding that adds to the mystery and personal significance of the photograph, without making claims about the supernatural." They agreed on an approach, and over the next week, they worked together to incorporate Jenna's findings into the exhibit materials. The photograph would be displayed prominently, with both the original scan and the enhanced version showing the face more clearly. Alongside it would be the historical documents, family narrative, and the side-by-side comparison with Thomas Blackwood's newspaper photograph, presented as an interesting discovery without definitive conclusions. As the exhibit opening approached, Sarah found herself increasingly preoccupied with the photograph and its story. She often stayed late at the museum, reviewing the materials and fine-tuning the presentation. One evening, about a week before the opening, she was alone in the conservation lab, looking at the original glass plate negative on the light table. The lab was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the climate control system. Outside, the sky had darkened, and rain tapped against the windows, creating a cozy, isolated atmosphere inside. Sarah was studying the negative, fascinated by how the image appeared in reverse, with dark areas light and light areas dark. In this inverse version, the face in the window appeared as a dark shape against a lighter background, somehow more distinct and unsettling than in the positive image. As she gazed at it, Sarah had the strange sensation that the face was looking back at her, aware of her scrutiny across the span of nearly 150 years. A sudden chill ran through the room, causing Sarah to shiver and glance up. The conservation lab was usually kept at a constant temperature to protect the artifacts, but it now felt decidedly cold. She rubbed her arms, wondering if the climate control system was malfunctioning. As she looked back down at the negative, she could have sworn the face had shifted slightly, the eyes now more directly focused on her. Sarah blinked, attributing the apparent movement to a trick of the light or her tired eyes. But the sensation of being watched persisted, growing stronger until she felt compelled to speak aloud, feeling slightly foolish as she did so. "Thomas? Is that you?" The words hung in the air, met only by silence and the continuing patter of rain against the windows. Sarah shook her head, smiling at her momentary flight of fancy. She had been immersed in this story for too long, allowing it to affect her imagination. She carefully returned the negative to its protective case and prepared to leave, turning off the light table and gathering her notes. As she reached for the light switch by the door, the overhead lights flickered briefly, and she felt a distinct pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere in the room had momentarily condensed. Sarah stood very still, her hand frozen halfway to the switch. The pressure subsided, and the lights stabilized, but the feeling of a presence remained. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was unmistakable, a sense that she was not alone in the room. "I'm helping to tell your story," she said softly, addressing the empty air. "People will remember what happened to you. They'll know that William tried to make amends, and that your family preserved your memory. If there's anything else you want people to know, you can show me somehow." She waited, feeling both ridiculous and strangely hopeful. For a moment, nothing happened, and she was about to turn off the lights and leave when she noticed the computer at Jenna's workstation had come on by itself. The screen glowed in the dim room, showing the enhanced image of the photograph that Jenna had been working on. Sarah approached the computer slowly, half expecting it to shut off again, but the image remained on the screen. As she watched, the focus of the photograph seemed to shift subtly, drawing her attention not to the face in the window but to something in the foreground she hadn't noticed before. One of the men seated in the front row, not William, but another manager, had his hand positioned oddly, partially hidden by his leg. When Sarah looked more closely, she could see what appeared to be a small lever or switch beneath his fingers, as if he were holding something concealed from the camera. Sarah leaned closer, fascinated by this new detail. She had no idea what it might signify, but it seemed deliberate, almost like a message meant to be noticed eventually. She quickly made a note of the man's position in the photograph, intending to check the mill records to identify him. The computer screen flickered once, then twice, and then shut off completely. The feeling of presence that had filled the room dissipated, leaving behind only the normal sounds and sensations of the empty museum at night. Sarah stood in the darkness for a moment, processing what had just happened, or what she believed had happened. Had her tired mind invented the entire experience? Or had something genuinely unusual occurred? She couldn't answer that question with any certainty, but she was determined to follow the new lead and identify the man with the concealed object. It might be nothing significant, or it might add another layer to the already complex story of Thomas Blackwood and the mill. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the museum early, eager to continue her investigation. She went straight to the archives, where she hoped to find employment records for the mill that might help identify all the individuals in the photograph. To her delight, the museum's collection included a ledger of mill employees from 1870 to 1880, complete with positions and brief descriptions. Using this resource and the clearly labeled copy of the photograph that William had fortunately annotated with names, she identified the man with the concealed object as Robert Hargrove, who had served as the mill's financial manager. Sarah then turned to newspapers from the years following the photograph, searching for any mention of Hargrove. She found what she was looking for in an article from 1877, 2 years after the photograph was taken. Mill financial manager arrested for embezzlement. According to the article, Robert Hargrove had been systematically embezzling funds from the mill for several years, a scheme that was only discovered during an audit after he made an uncharacteristically large withdrawal. The article mentioned that Thomas Blackwood had apparently suspected the embezzlement before his death and had been looking into the mill's financial records, a task outside his normal duties as mechanical supervisor. This new information cast the accident in a different light. Had Thomas's death truly been an accident, or could Robert Hargrove have had a motive to silence someone who was getting too close to uncovering his crimes? The concealed object in the photograph suddenly seemed more sinister, possibly a key to the financial records or some other item related to the embezzlement. Sarah brought her findings to David and Jenna, who were as intrigued as she was by this new development. They agreed to adjust the exhibit to include this additional layer of the story, presenting it as a historical mystery that added complexity to the personal and social narrative they had already constructed. The exhibit, titled Shadows of Progress: The Human Cost of Industrialization, opened the following week to considerable local interest. The centerpiece, as planned, was the 1875 group photograph with its mysterious face in the window, accompanied by the historical context, personal narrative, and the new questions raised by the discovery about Robert Hargrove. Visitors were fascinated by the multi-layered story, which touched on technological change, workplace safety, personal guilt and redemption, family memory, and possibly even crime. The image itself drew people in, with many standing before it for long minutes, studying the face in the window and the now highlighted figure of Robert Hargrove with his concealed object. Some visitors shared their own family stories of industrial accidents or workplace injustices, creating a dialogue that extended beyond the specific case of Thomas Blackwood. Others discussed their beliefs about the supernatural elements of the story, offering various interpretations of the face in the window and what it might represent. Amelia Whitaker attended the opening night and was visibly moved by the presentation of her family's story. She spent a long time looking at the photograph and reading the accompanying text, occasionally nodding as if in recognition or agreement. "You've done a wonderful job," she told Sarah as the evening wound down. "Thomas would be pleased, I think. His story hasn't been forgotten, and now it's helping people understand a broader history." "Thank you," Sarah replied, touched by the comment. "That means a lot, especially coming from you." Amelia smiled, her eyes still on the photograph. "You know, family stories often get dismissed as unreliable or sentimental, but they carry truths that official records sometimes miss. The emotional reality of events, the personal impacts that ripple through generations. These are just as important to understanding history as dates and facts." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's exactly what we tried to show here. The intersection of documented history and personal narrative, and how they inform each other." After Amelia left, Sarah remained in the exhibit hall, watching as the last few visitors made their way through the displays. The museum would be closing soon, but she wasn't quite ready to leave. She found herself drawn back to the photograph, standing before it as countless others had done throughout the evening. In the quiet of the nearly empty room, she studied the face in the window once more. It seemed different somehow, less angry or accusatory than she had initially perceived it. Perhaps it was just her imagination, influenced by the satisfaction of having told Thomas's story more fully, or perhaps there was something genuinely different about the image itself. As she gazed at the photograph, Sarah felt a sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed. Thomas Blackwood's story had been recovered from the margins of history, his life and death acknowledged not just as a statistic in the ledger of industrial progress, but as a human experience with lasting impact. William Whitaker's guilt and attempts at redemption had been documented, showing how tragedy could lead to positive change. And the possible criminal actions of Robert Hargrove had been brought to light, adding a new dimension to the historical record. The photograph had served its purpose across nearly 150 years, preserving memory, prompting questions, connecting generations, and ultimately revealing truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. Whether the face in the window was a genuine, supernatural phenomenon, a coincidental photographic anomaly, or something in between, its power to affect those who viewed it was undeniable. As Sarah finally turned to leave, she glanced back at the photograph one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the face in the window fade slightly, as if releasing its hold on the physical world now that its story had been told. But when she looked more directly, it appeared unchanged, a permanent part of the image that would continue to intrigue and unsettle viewers for years to come. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the night sky was clear, stars visible above the small town that had grown and changed around the now-vanished mill. Sarah walked to her car, feeling a connection to the past that was both professional and deeply personal. As a curator, she had helped preserve and present history. As a human being, she had engaged with the emotional reality of lives long ended, but not forgotten. The story of Thomas Blackwood and the mysterious photograph would continue to be part of Millfield's collective memory, a reminder that history is not just a series of events, but a complex web of human experiences, actions, and consequences that echo through time. And perhaps, in some way that defied rational explanation, Thomas himself would remain present in that image, watching from the window as generations came and went, finding new meaning in his story.